Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and I want to do yet another discussion topic video, and the subject, similar to last time, is Shenmue 3. Now, for those who don't know, I did a Kickstarter. There was a rumor about a Kickstarter option to get Shenmue 3 made, and I made a 29-minute video about how that's not happening, and alternatives on how to make Shenmue 3 happen. Okay? Now, let me just say first and foremost, you should go see that video before watching this one. But I also want to say that despite the title, I'm not offering you any news, okay? Like, Shenmue 3 on the PS4 is not like some confirmed thing that I'm talking about. It's a rumor, and it's speculation, and I'm addressing it, okay? So, take all of this with a grain of salt. This is all my opinion. This is based on possibilities and a hypothesis of what may or may not happen. But I have no basis for much of this other than just my best guess. So again, this is not news saying that Shenmue 3 is going to happen on the PS4. Got it? Okay. Now, before I talk about it, I also want to say I want to encourage, get out your cameras, because I want to encourage video responses to this video, okay? I want to hear a lot of people's thoughts about this. Now, let's get into it. There is a new rumor surfacing about Shenmue 3. Earlier this month, not long ago, Yu Suzuki went to a convention, and he was asked if he would consider using Kickstarter as an option to get Shenmue 3 made. And what he said was, maybe. People took that way out of context, and they just assumed he was doing it, which is entirely what my previous video was about, was saying, no, that's not happening, just calm down. But that has had a bit of an effect. It has actually snowballed, that rumor. It got to front headlines of major gaming publications, which is good. It got Shenmue back into the public consciousness. And, my video on it had like 4,000 views at the time I make this, and a lot of people made videos. Especially, I want to thank all the people who made response videos to that one. And again, make response videos to this one. But a lot of people were talking about Shenmue 3 again, even though there was no real concrete evidence, based solely on a mistranslated rumor. Okay? So what my point is that Shenmue has a lot of interest still in it. And there is a new rumor now. And I think that the new rumor, assuming there's any validity to it, might simply be piggybacking on the original rumor. We might have accidentally generated a lot of Shenmue interest that has actually not only got the attention of us fans, but also the actual game makers. And I don't mean just Yu Suzuki, I mean Sega, Sony, and so on. Because, they must read news. It's not like they haven't heard about this. So it's entirely possible that what is going on now is a direct result of that. So what happened was, there was a photo that surfaced of Yu Suzuki, the man who created Shenmue, created a lot of Sega's major titles such as Virtua Fighter, Outrun, Afterburner, and a lot of others. Sega's Shigeru Miyamoto, basically, although ironically he had nothing to do with Sonic the Hedgehog. And he met up with Mark Cerny. Now, Mark Cerny is the lead architect of the PlayStation 4. So the photo consists of the two of them standing together. Okay? Now, I'm going to be very honest when I say that I think the photo doesn't mean anything. I think, logically, what's going on is the two of them are at a convention and they just ran into each other in the bathroom and they're like, oh, hey, you're famous, so are you. Let's take a photo together. I pretty much think that's all that happened. But the story that is out there right now, the rumor that is out there that currently, at the time I make this, cannot actually be disproven, but probably isn't true, because we Shenmue fans get burned all the time. The rumor is that they met up to discuss the possibility of Shenmue 3 as an exclusive to a Sony console. Now that sounds awesome, but let's all calm down a little bit here. Like I said, I don't think this is going to happen. I want to be very clear about that. But I would like to discuss the possibility of it happening. I want to talk about why it would actually make sense if that did happen. Now again, I don't think it's going to. And I don't think there's anything true to these rumors. All we have is a photo of them together and a Twitter post that claimed they were getting together to discuss Shenmue 3. But, you know, like any of the rumors, it's probably not true. All we do have for certain is that they took a photo together, which doesn't mean really anything. But, like I said, let's discuss the idea that this could happen, how it could happen, and why it makes sense. Now, first off, the first place we have to discuss is actually not Shenmue itself. I've discussed at length. Please go watch the Shenmue 3 Kickstarter video I did. Please go watch that. I explain a lot about not only how that rumor specifically isn't true, but also how you could actually go about getting it made. And I actually did say in that video that if you were going to do an exclusive deal, and this means where Sega doesn't pay for the game themselves, like they don't say, all right, we're going to make it, we're going to put it on every console out there and just hope for the best, and we're also going to put it on PC, etc. Sega will not do that. That's been very clear. So I said the alternative to getting it, other than like a Kickstarter type of fan support, the only other way to get it out there is if one of the console makers decides they want to pay to have exclusive rights to it. And I said the only one that made sense was Sony, and that the PS4 was the only console that made any real sense to put it on. I did say that, and I stand by that. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence, and these, again, are all rumors based on a photo, which doesn't mean much, but it is entirely possible that that will happen, and here's why. Aside from all the stuff that surrounds Shenmue, you have to actually look at Sony themselves. Now, Sony obviously is in it to win it. They want to win the console war. Now, they have a history of, even though this pains me as a Sega fanatic, they did win the PS1 and the PS2 battles. They did. That's just the reality of it. They sold the most units, they won. Now, PS3 is a very different story. PS3 has sold 77 million consoles worldwide. Now, the 360 actually sold 76. Now, of course, that just sounds like, oh, Sony won. Did they? The reason that those numbers are skewed like that is because in Japan, they've only sold 2 million 360s. That's not good. That's the only reason that the numbers are so different, is because Sony has a stranglehold on the Japanese market, but they can't really crack the North American and European market. Not in the way that the 360's been able to, especially in North America. The 360 dominates in North America. Now, the reason I think the 360 dominates in North America, and I swear I'm going somewhere with all this, you guys we just need to talk about history before we can talk about how this might eventually affect Shenmue. I promise I'll get to it. But the 360 probably dominates for a few different reasons. One was that it was launched a year earlier. Alright, so it had a year more to get into homes. And unlike the Dreamcast that tried that, they had the money to continue to push it. Even though it suffered from certain lacking features, most notably the Blu-ray player. But as it turns out, that actually didn't matter much. And the reason I say that is when Sony eventually launched the PS3 a year later, they put in the Blu-ray player basically hoping to recreate the success of the PS2. Now, the reason the PS2 was a success is because it had a DVD player built in. Now, in 2000, that was huge. You know, you have to understand that VHS was the dominant video format at that point. And people were ready to move on, because VHS has been around since the late 70s. Yeah, it's been a while. And so they decided, okay, we're going to make this, and people, really adopted it, because they were like, yeah, I'm tired of these stupid VHS tapes, I want to move on. The problem with Blu-ray, though, is they couldn't make that trick work again, because they launched it 6 years later. 6! In 2006, the PS3 launches. And they expected everyone to just update their video libraries all over again. That's way too soon, but, I mean, the VHS lifespan was the late 70s to 2000, and technically cut off in 2005. Only a year before the PS3 launched with Blu-ray. Now, we won't really count those last 5 years for VHS, because they were just straight downhill until it went under, which makes sense. Enough time had gone by, but DVDs... Sony expected us to give up on DVD after 6 years. That's not nearly long enough. And nobody really bought it for a Blu-ray player. I mean, some did, but the other problem with it at launch is that it cost $600. Now, it wasn't necessarily overpriced. It had a lot of hardware in it. Blu-ray technology was expensive, especially 7 years ago. And it's hard to believe, but it was 7 years ago when that console came out. Well, 6.5. And the other thing is it also supported the PS2, which means it had all the chipsets and everything in there required to be able to play PS2 games naturally in full backwards compatibility and not emulation. That's a big difference. Now, eventually they realized that wasn't a good idea, because that really just helped Microsoft. People went and went, wow, PS3, $600, no thanks, I don't want it. Because they didn't have any killer titles for it either. Gotta remember that too. So, the PS3 had an incredibly bad start, and was already a year behind the 360, and took a couple more years to kind of catch up, and really still has not caught up in North America, and it's not going to. That's just a reality, it's not going to. So it had a bad start. And then the problem with it as it continued was that we have to acknowledge a very sad reality about video games the way they are right now. And I think Mark from Classic Game Room says this all the time, and he's totally right. The PS3 and the 360 are basically the same machine. Now, what I mean by that is, obviously they're not identical, of course. The PS3 is a superior machine in terms of its technology. That's not debatable. It is. It has a Blu-ray support. It's got an extra year's worth of technology in it. It is a more powerful machine. But that doesn't really matter, because what we get is pretty much two consoles that are almost identical in terms of their software library, meaning they all basically have the same games. There are not a whole lot of exclusive titles for each one. Now, there definitely are some, but let's call it what it is. I mean, Microsoft had better luck with that because they had purchased more of the exclusives. And by that I mean like your Halos. Halo is huge. That cracked into the public in a way that most games can't even dream of. Where it's a system seller. Everybody wanted that game. Personally, I don't really know why. I never thought Halo was that great. I'm not saying it's bad, of course. I'm just saying I never understood why everybody crapped their pants over it, but they did. They had other successful exclusives such as Gears of War, and for a while there they had Mass Effect, and they had other ones. Now, Sony, of course, had its own exclusives. The ones they had paid for. They had, their little Big Planet. They had Metal Gear Solid 4 was a big one. They had a few others, but there weren't really that many games that were making everybody go, damn, I need to get a PS3. There just weren't. People own the PS3, certainly. I have a few. I actually have 3 of those things. But that's just because they made different models, and I'm unique in that situation because I'm a freaky collector. But your average American who plays video games, at least in my experience anyway, and this includes, I guess, Canadians as well, probably Europeans actually, just don't have a PS3. And if they do, they're kind of alone in that. And, I mean, obviously there's a ton of people that use a PS3. I'm not saying there aren't. But we have to accept that most of the people who have a PS3 are Japanese. Or at least that's where it's the most popular. So let's look forward a bit here. Sony doesn't want to recreate that kind of atmosphere for the PS4. They don't want to be in second or third if you include the Wii. We're going to ignore the Wii for this whole thing because the Wii is a different thing altogether. It's by a game company, which is an important distinction, by the way. Microsoft and Sony are not game companies. It's a computer company, an electronics company that happen to have a video game section and a department. Nintendo is a game company that makes games and a game console. They're a very different thing. But Nintendo has no real place in this debate because, well, first of all, they're not going to have Shenmue 3. That's never going to happen. And because they make a lot of their own software. Sony and Microsoft more or less just pay studios to do it. That's a bit different. Now, they do have their own game studios, but again, that's just something that they paid for. They are not game companies. They are just not. But that aside, so we have to ignore the Wii and the Wii U for this whole discussion. That means the PS3 was always trailing the Xbox 360 except Japan. And as I explained in my Shenmue 3 rant, the other one, the Kickstarter one, you will never see Shenmue 3 on a Microsoft console as an exclusive because of its sheer inability to crack the Japanese market. It won't happen. But the PS4 has a shot. And the reason it has a shot is, one, it will dominate Japan over the 720. It just will. That's going to happen. I don't care what Microsoft puts on there. They will never crack Japan. They just won't. But Sony does have a shot at taking North America and Europe. But only if they do things differently than Microsoft. That's been their problem, is they basically are just doing what Microsoft has been doing for this whole generation, just not as well. And one of the most notable examples, of course, is the online services. Your Xbox Live and your PlayStation Network. Now, a lot of people, particularly youngins out there, will maintain that the PlayStation Network is better than Xbox Live. And why do they say that? Because they're not actually looking at the network service itself. They're looking at the fact that the PlayStation Network is free, unless you include PlayStation Plus, and that Xbox Live is not. That's really what it comes down to. Now, Xbox Live, I don't care if you think the PlayStation Network is better because it's free. It's not a better network. It just isn't. And the fact that it's not a better network simply because they don't charge for it. You know, Microsoft charges for it not to be greedy assholes. It's because they use the money to make the network good and to make it better. Sony doesn't do that, so their network will never compete with theirs. Now, that personally does not matter to me because I don't play things online, but a lot of people do. So Sony is basically doing what Microsoft is doing, but not as well in that regard. And the same goes, like I said, for exclusive titles. You know, they basically both share all the same games, but the 360 version tends to be better. And it's not because the 360 is more powerful. In fact, it is a weaker console. The reason it's better is because it's easier to program for. And a lot of people, like the developers who are making the games, go, well, we're going to put it on both, so make it for the 360, because that's just easier. And then we'll just port it over to the PS3 instead of the other way around, because that's trickier. At least that's my understanding. I am not a programmer. But that is what I've read. Therefore, the ports are never quite as good, you know, because they're not developed with that machine in mind. Now, there are definitely some games that totally take advantage of the PS3, such as Metal Gear Solid 4. But those games are very few and far between. And even though Metal Gear Solid is a popular and big series, it is not Halo. It just isn't. And the other games that are really big and really popular, your Call of Duties, it's amazing how many of those games there are, and Grand Theft Autos and so on, they just end up on both. So if you're in North America, or probably Europe as well, maybe Australia, odds are you have a 360, and that's what you get most of your games for. I mean, really, ask yourself, if you have both, don't you typically get them for the 360? And do you know why you do that? Personally, I don't know why I do that, but I do that, and I know a lot of people do. And I know that I get them for the 360 probably because I care maybe a little bit more about achievements, maybe because that's where I started my collection, you know, in that generation. And I tend to use the PS3 as nothing more than a media center. And I hear that happens a lot. And it comes down to the fact that Microsoft got into people's homes first with that generation. And we have to understand something else. A lot of game buyers are not people my age or older. They're people younger, a lot younger. And I'm talking about kids. Now, if you're a kid, you're going to buy the console your friends have. That's normal. You know, you want to, if your friend has a 360, all your friends have 360s, you're going to get a 360. Because you want to be like your friends. You want to play online with your friends. You want to have the same games as your friends. You want to borrow games from your friends and so on. You can't do that if you're the kid with the PS3. Because unless, of course, you live in some weird area in North America where everyone has PS3s. Because personally, I don't know, I have a lot of friends. I literally don't know anyone, like in my immediate friendship group, who has a PS3. I'm the only one. But they all have 360s. So I think there's really something to that, if you guys are kind of following my logic. So what does Sony do to avoid this for the next generation? Well, the obvious answer is exclusives. Now, you probably see where I'm going with this, but hold your horses. There is another factor to consider to the possibility that these rumors about Mark Cerny and Yu Suzuki getting together to discuss Shenmue 3 are true. First, we have to understand that Yu Suzuki has been very clear that he wants to make Shenmue 3. Oh man, does he want to make it. And let's pretend Sega was on board, you know, just ignore that X factor. Mark Cerny would have to see where things are going, and I think he might. And I'm just speculating because I think I see where things are going in the gaming industry, and he might as well. The thing he might be concerned about, which personally I'm concerned about, is what Microsoft is talking about doing. They're talking about making their consoles, the next one, 720, Durango, whatever it ends up being called, probably the next Xbox, because they're not a particularly creative group when it comes to titles, but then again, neither is Sony. PS1, PS2, PS3, PS4. Big surprise. I think that a lot of the rumors that are out there are pretty horrible about the 720. At the point I'm making this video, this may all end up being nothing. Odds are most of what I'm talking about will ultimately not matter. We may know next month. In April we might know. Sometime in April, Microsoft's doing its big convention thing to discuss the 720, and we'll get a lot more information then. But one of the things they're talking about is no-use game support, which is a big, big no-no. I don't like that. Because that means you couldn't rent games, it means you couldn't borrow games, it means you couldn't sell your games. They'd be worthless after they were modified in whatever way by your console. Or if you wanted to play used games, you'd have to buy a license or something, and it'd be like another $20, and it'd just make it not worth it. Or, rare games would be totally worthless. I'm just saying there's a lot of problems with that, but that's a separate thing. Other things they're talking about is not allowing the console to read directly off discs. It would have to install the game first and actually would never even attempt to read a game off a disc except for the installation, which is a big problem. They're talking about making the console stay online all the time. Kind of the way like EA was doing that thing with The Sims, where they said, oh, you're playing offline, that's great and all, there's no online gameplay mechanic to this, or at least you're not using that, but it doesn't matter, you gotta be connected online or the game won't work. Microsoft's talking about doing something incredibly similar. And there are other rumors about how the Kinect will have to be connected at all times in order for it to work, and it'll have to detect you. If it detects your friend, it won't work anymore. Those are, again, rumors that could all be squashed next month. But let's assume, again, that these things are true. Okay? There's another big one. EA, and you can look this up yourselves, it was posted sometime late last month, February. EA was talking about the possibility of going exclusive to Microsoft. Take a second and think about that. EA going exclusive to Microsoft would be very damaging to Sony. And you can look at the Dreamcast for that one. So EA, they refused to support the Dreamcast because they were so pissed off at Sega for basically abandoning the Saturn. And honestly, I kind of got to agree with them on that, which I never thought I would say, but it's true. EA is, I'm not sure if it's still true, they might be number 2 now, but they were at least number 1 in third-party development. Number 1. Possibly number 2. And if they decide to go exclusive to one console, that's really going to hurt their competition. Tremendously. Even though, personally, I can't even think of an EA game that I like. I don't really play any EA games. Maybe the Mass Effect series. I guess I kind of forgot about that, but ignoring that one, really, which does share some similarities to Shenmue in terms of transferring your save and all that. Ignoring all that, what would Sony do to fix that? How could they even do that? That would be a huge move. Now, let's assume again that is true, which personally I don't think it is. I don't think EA would do that, but now that I think about it, maybe they would. Here's the thing, guys. EA is getting shittier and shittier. Somehow they won an award for being the worst company in America, and they're actually in the running for it again. The Golden Poop, I think is what it's called. They're actually in the running again. And they might actually win, which is unprecedented. Nobody's won that twice in a row. Because usually when you win that, you want to improve. They seem to be going in the opposite direction. Now, the SimCity thing was a perfect example of this. Just being douchebags. Just to be douchebags. Killing off franchises, ruining perfectly good series, and basically screwing over the consumer for their bottom line. And that's a big one right there. Now, let's pretend that EA does do that, and that's the direction they've decided they want to go. Because they have been very clear about the fact that microtransactions are in their future, permanently. That's what they said. The example they used was they said a new Battlefield game, right? So, alright, first, microtransactions, in case you guys don't know, microtransactions are basically DLC, but taken to the most evil of levels. DLC started out as something incredibly noble and has been horribly corrupted. And they're going to make it even worse. Because microtransactions are the ability to buy something in-game and continue playing said game. Now, what they're talking about, the example that was used was a new Battlefield game. Let's say you're playing the game and you're just getting your ass kicked, you're not doing well, and you want to beat, obviously, your competition. But instead of going and finding like a better gun, you can't do that anymore. What they're going to do is start charging you. They're like, hey, you want the better gun? Give us $5, it's yours. And you can go kill everybody. And I get the feeling that a lot of especially the younger generation, is going to agree to that. Which blows my mind. I mean, I grew up in the 90s. DLC in the 90s was like the Sonic and Knuckles cartridge you put on Sonic 2 and Sonic 3. Oh, extra content. That was DLC in the 90s, man. It wasn't horribly ruined the way they are kind of going with it now. But, I mean, if that's the direction EA wants to go, there's things to consider. If they're going to go in that way, they're going to look at Microsoft and be like, you guys want to keep your console online all the time and fuck over your customers? Shit, yes, we are totally on board. We love that. You guys have the better online network. The kind of network that would be able to even sustain a consistent system of microtransactions. Here's the thing. The PlayStation Network is fine, but there's no way, I mean, I don't think it could possibly handle that level of traffic where you have to keep buying content constantly to make the game go. But Xbox Live, and the fact that there's that much extra money dumped into it, I think it could handle that. In fact, I'm sure it could, because otherwise they wouldn't be considering this. So you gotta think that there's actually some validity to the rumor that EA might do that. Because it would benefit them and benefit Microsoft. So it's possible that some of the things like keeping it online is not really a Microsoft idea. It's more of an EA idea that Microsoft's like, if you want to be exclusive to us and that's what we got to do, we'll do it. Because we have no problem shutting down servers and fucking over our customers, as is proof with the original Xbox, and is proof. We're going to see this in like a year or two when they shut down all the 360 stuff and all that DLC, all those patches, everything is just gone. And can't access it anymore, and it's gonna be bad. And people will see that, probably, hopefully not too late, but it's gonna happen. And I can easily see Microsoft doing that. They dropped the original Xbox like a dirty shirt, and I have no reason to think they're gonna continue to, continue these 360 after they put out the 720 or Durango or whatever. So it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if the two of them work together for some sort of evil goal like that. Now, there's another thing to consider to this possibility that it may sound trivial, but EA and Microsoft are both American companies. Sony is not. Now, this has nothing to do with like I can't speak. This has nothing to do with like Japan versus the US, what's better, any stupid national argument, international argument like that. There's nothing like that to this. You have to remember that companies are just people, okay? They're just people running an entity. They're not a self-contained life form, which is something strange about human beings. We tend to believe that. We tend to think that, oh, a company, Nintendo, they're one person running this whole thing that's got all the ideas. They are a conglomerate of one guy who makes all these choices. It's nothing like that. It's just dudes on making phone calls and saying like, "What do you think? You think this will make money? I don't know. I work here. I just started working here. I'm gonna be fired." That's what a company is. And when these two American companies have the same culture and the same shared language and the same basically bubble that they live in, Microsoft and EA both live in this delusion that everyone in the world has like the best internet connection because they live in the US. Our internet connections are generally considered pretty good. Not the best. I think that goes to South Korea. But I think we've ranked number 2 in that. But they probably live with the delusion that nobody would ever have a problem with this. I'd love to see them try this in a country that doesn't have particularly good internet access. Not going to go over well. So it wouldn't really surprise me if that's all it really is the fact that they can easily communicate. Whereas if you're going to deal with Sony, Sony of course has an American headquarters. It has a European headquarters. But it is ultimately a Japanese company. And you have to talk to Japanese people who have a different language. They have a different cultural background. They have a different philosophy on things. I'm just saying that there's a lot of translation that has to happen there in order to make something like that work. So it's entirely possible that that might ultimately also fuel the possibility that, you know, Microsoft and EA might do some weird, I don't want to say merger, but exclusive deal. So let's assume the worst of all scenarios here, which is that Microsoft and EA form this super douche company, because it would be horrible. All the things they're talking about doing. I don't think I'd get one. And that's a pretty bold claim, because I have like 120 game consoles. Well, granted, a lot of them are doubles. But, and that's not an exaggeration, by the way. It's 120, probably more. The idea that they would do that would actually make me go, I don't want that thing. I just don't want it. You know, I don't want this console I can't really collect for, that's going to screw me over and will inevitably cease to work. And not because it'll get the red ring of death or anything, but because even if it's fully functional for 30 years, in like, let's say 7 or 8 years when they shut those servers down, that console's just a box that lights up. That's all it'll be, because it won't be able to play anything. But again, these are assuming all the darkest possible scenarios. You have to look over at Sony and go, well, what the hell are they going to do to compete with that kind of juggernaut? And Sony, fortunately, has come out and said, well, we will allow used games. But they have also they've kind of screwed us on the backwards compatibility thing. But after the way they got burned with the PS3, I guess I can't totally blame them. Although I'm really surprised it won't support PS1 and PS2. Because at this point, especially with the PS1, emulation on those kinds of machines would be so simple. In fact, I mean, that's how the PS3 plays PS1 games. It's just emulation. And that can't be hard, but they want you to rebuy the games online. They're going to do digital versions. They want you to repay for them, because even though it sounds like I'm just ragging on Microsoft, I hate Sony, you know, for the same reason. You know, they're going to screw you on that kind of thing, but at least they're willing to make some concessions, where it sounds, again, based on rumors, that Microsoft is not. So, if EA does all this, and all these horrible things happen, what does Sony do to compete? Exclusives. It's the only answer I can think of. Because they're not going to get all those majority of titles. They're going to keep getting weaker versions of the same games. They're going to get... they're not going to have an installed fan base. Not a big one, not nearly the kind that they want. And the only market they're guaranteed to win is Japan. So the only thing they can do to crack into North America and Europe in that regard, other than just maybe they'll get lucky, because if Microsoft does all that, that could just kill them off. You know, like they might be like, wow, that was a horrible mistake. Our console's worthless. People don't like getting screwed over consistently. Sony might win by default. But if they actually want to try to win, well, this is what they got to do. They need exclusives, and they need like good exclusives. And I don't mean like, oh, they need another first-person shooter that you can only get, like Resistance, you know, on their console. They need stuff that's unique and interesting. I'm afraid for where gaming is going. Not just because of all the horrible digital options that are coming up there, the things that are actually getting worse and worse and worse, but also the fact that the games themselves are actually ceasing to be particularly interesting. Now, there are, of course, plenty of wonderful titles that still come out, but a lot of them don't really see that kind of mainstream, you know, push. And a lot of them are just Call of Duty clones and Grand Theft Auto clones. Clones get rewarded more than original content, say Shenmue. And that's a big problem, because if combined what Microsoft might be doing with the fact that games are getting less and less original, and the fact that we're getting more and more of them, and they keep flooding and flooding and flooding, you might see a repeat of the 1983 video game crash. That's a very real possibility. But that's a thing we get to talk about, you know, in the future at some point. So back to the discussion of exclusives. Sony will need to appeal to fans of video games, because a lot of people are going to feel burned if Microsoft does all this. So the only way Sony's going to compete is basically, in my opinion, if they go after a company like Sega and say, like, you guys have serious potential to make original games. Not quite as well as they used to do it, but let's ignore all of Sega's internal problems. Let's just assume they could rehire all the talent that once made them so legendary. Let's assume all that, which is a massive assumption. Let's assume they do that. Sony's going to have to go to them and be like, you guys got to help us. Which maybe Sega wouldn't want to. They'd be like, well, you're kind of in the same position we were in when you basically drove us under. So, fuck you. They might be like that, which I doubt because they are a company that wants to stay in business. But Sega makes almost all of its money on pachinko machines in Japan. Maybe they wouldn't really care. Now, that's a weird statistic, isn't it? But it's true. But let's assume that Sega's immediately on board and they've immediately got all the talent, which again, huge assumptions. Sony would actually end up paying them to bring out new content. Maybe you'd get your Streets of Rage 4. Maybe you'd get your Grand Radio 3. Maybe you'd get Sonic Adventure 3. All those major titles that people have been craving for forever. But while great, none of them are system sellers. And I think the reason none of them are system sellers is because Sega fans, we have to understand we kind of live in a bubble. We think of Sega as like this great gaming company that made all this awesome stuff that just how the hell doesn't everybody know about this? Well, it's true. Not everybody knows about it. Sonic the Hedgehog is the only Sega property, really, that was ever able to crack through said bubble and get to the mainstream media. Most of what people remember about the early 90s video games, oh, Legend of Zelda, Super Mario World, Metroid, and so on. Sonic, they remember, but he's the only one from the Sega side of things. And it's not because Sega stuff wasn't good. It was fantastic. It's just Sega's marketing was never very good. And that has caught up and bit them in the ass when they got to the Dreamcast, and still does, because when they release new games, nothing really sells unless it's a Sonic title. Because if you're a parent now, odds are you remember that console war, and you go, I remember Sonic, he was great, I'll get that. I don't know what Rystar is, I'm not buying that. Or Knight's Journey into Dreams or whatever for the Wii. Sega fans were like, yes, a new Knight's game, oh my god, finally. But it didn't do well at all because nobody remembered Knights except for us. And of course that game was terrible, but that's a separate thing. Like I said, Sega would have to get over that problem and they'd have to actually hire talent. Which, the only guys I think at Sega right now that are particularly talented are the Yakuza guys and the guys at Sumo Digital who make Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, and they made Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, which that game is tough as nails and they really screwed up that aspect of it. Although they released a patch, it is better now, but still... It's still a little broken, in my estimation. But my point is, those guys are, as far as I can tell, like the only two talented groups left. Sega would have to basically do what they did during the Dreamcast era, which is reestablish AM2, reestablish Smilebit, and so on and so forth. Sonic Team. Try to get some solid stuff out there. But again, only if Sony would pay for it. Now, let's come all the way back around to Shenmue. I told you it would take a while, but I wanted you guys to understand the backstory of this. The reason that Sony would go after something like Shenmue is that Shenmue 3 is unique. It is the last unicorn in this regard. Because think about how many unawaited titles could be potential system sellers. There's not many. And especially exclusive ones. Like, sure, your Halo 5 or whatever will be a system seller, but it's obvious where that's going. And Grand Theft Auto 5, also a system seller, but for who? It's on both. Shenmue 3 is unique in that neither of them own it, and it could do something like that. Now, let's be fair. Shenmue 3 will never be the mainstream type of game that those are. That's never going to happen. So it won't win on that massive type of appeal. But it does have the unique advantage of being able to appeal to a lot of hardcore gamers, especially ones who really don't like Sony, myself included. They can... If Sony were to put out Shenmue 3, if they were to finance that, it'd be pretty easy to forgive them for a lot of the things I disliked them for. I mean, really, it would. If they basically brought Sega back, you could ignore all that other stuff, but if they brought Shenmue 3 back, that would be huge. I mean, that would be huge. That'd be fantastic. And I think that they might actually consider that, because if they look down the road, they know they can't repeat what they just did in the PS3 360 generation. They have no desire to come in last. And they can't seem to make their exclusives interesting. At least enough to a massive audience. But Shenmue 3 could win over a substantial number of gamer fanatics who aren't really sure what they want in the next generation. And you remember what I said before about, well, the 360 was out a year earlier, so people got it earlier, it's snowballed. The same could be true of the PlayStation 4 if it has Shenmue 3. Because a lot of us would be like, well, I'm getting that game. And then it immediately identifies in your brain as like, well, this is the game console. This is the one I'm going to be playing a lot. And then you start to collect for that system and not for the Microsoft alternative. Does that make sense? You guys following me on this? So, I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think that any of this is actually going to happen. I don't think that Mark Cerny meeting up with Yu Suzuki will actually yield Shenmue 3. But it certainly would make sense if Sony wants to win that generation. Because making Shenmue 3, I mean, that would be huge. I mean, think about the amount of press that game got just from the failed Kickstarter rumor. I mean, we all were kind of somewhat responsible. I know I was. You know, I made a video that about 4,000 people saw, and it's, you know, continues to go out, and we keep talking about it. And that's what we got to keep doing. That's why I plead, all of you, I beg you, make video responses. Keep talking about this. Because for all we know, that simple rumor that went out of, you know, went crazy. Maybe, you know, Mark Cerny sat down, he was looking at a computer, and he's like, wow, Shenmue 3, people are going nuts over a failed rumor. What if we actually made it? Mind blown, right? You know, you could actually get a lot of push. That might be exactly what Sony needs to make the PS4 interesting and not just like the same. I like that direction. Not only for Shenmue 3, but also because, assuming any of this happens, it would give incentive for the consoles to actually be different. You know, like I said before, they're basically the same thing. They basically share all the same games with a handful of exceptions here and there. But to have, like, maybe not Sega completely backing you, but to have something like Shenmue 3 and to try to win a console war with actual exclusives, man, that would hark back to, oh, it's sad to think about, but, you know, back to basically the Dreamcast era, where your system was determined by its software library, not the other crap it could do. That's, you know, that's the sad reality of where we are with games right now. But okay, anyway, back on point. Shenmue 3 probably won't happen as a result of this thing, but you never know. This is somewhat of a valid position, and I could see a very logical projection where they actually go, this makes sense to do. But, as I've said before, especially in that rant video, if they were going to do it, they'd have to do it right. You know, they couldn't just be like, oh, we'll whip out Shenmue 3, kind of the way like Duke Nukem 0 came out, where they just made something called that. It would have to actually be good. Now, my assumption is, with Yu Suzuki behind it, it probably would be good. But again, you know, who knows? I mean, all sorts of titles you thought they couldn't screw up, they screwed up. Remember Sonic 06? Ugh. Yeah, you know, it could certainly happen. As for Sega's position on it, they basically just have to, you know, if Sony wanted to pay them for it, they basically have to say, okay, here's the license, we get a cut of the money, you guys can just run off and go make the thing. Let's hope that that's all Sega would do, because I would kind of want them to ironically stay out of it. They could publish it or whatever, but, you know, I wouldn't want them to actually try and get a lot of their in-house development teams to make it, unless they said, okay, Yu Suzuki, you can use all the guys over the Yakuza team to make this, because that could be something serious. Now, as for its release, man, you know, we'd have to discuss how it could go about getting released. Now, I've said before they would have to release Shenmue 1 and 2 in all probability. In fact, they would have to do it to make it work because of the save feature. The question is how. And I think that they might, and again, this is all hearsay and just rumors, and we're just discussing. We're talking about how nice it would be and what they would have to do to make it work. But what I think they would probably do is throw it up on the PlayStation Network and maybe Xbox Live Arcade. Maybe. Depends. If Sony paid for it, then of course it would only be on, you know, the PlayStation Network and so on. They might do that as kind of a way to test things. And from there, which we'd all buy it, I know I would, which I hate digital gaming, and I wouldn't really like putting it on a PlayStation console, but for Shenmue, I would do it. And, you know, I mean, like I said, it would hurt to put Sega's masterpiece, their best game ever, in my opinion, the best game ever made. It would hurt to put it on the company that ran Sega into the ground other than themselves, but we have to accept that. I accept it as a massive Sega fanatic, and I hope you accept it. Because otherwise, the idea that we're ever going to get a Dreamcast 2, please stop asking that. That will never happen. And if it did, if Sega lost their mind and made a new console, it would never be called that because they are original. They come up with names for systems. even if the names are kind of weird sometimes. But that doesn't matter. If they were going to release it, they'd probably do a digital release, and then I would hope later they do a physical release. Now, they would probably do a Shenmue 1 and 2 collection as one disc, kind of the way that they did with that Dreamcast collection. They released all those games on the arcade first, then put out a physical release. But what concerns me is that Dreamcast collection that we all said we wanted, nobody bought. I did, but I see that thing in bargain bins all the time. Nobody really bought that, and that's alarming, because if Sega and Sony were cool enough to actually make this go, we'd have to support it. Because if we didn't, I mean, that would burn any bridges we have with credibility to try and get something like this ever made ever again. And that would be bad. I would hope what Sega and Sony would agree to on this is a physical release called something like Shenmue Saga. Don't call it just Shenmue. That would be a bad idea, because everyone would think it was just this game. That would be a bad idea. Call it something like Shenmue Saga. And it has all of Shenmue 1. It has all of Shenmue 2. You can pick which one you want, and then it has the unmade Shenmue 3. Now, I highly doubt they'd put What's Shenmue on there. This is a demo called What's Shenmue. It's, you play as Ryo, you're in a map on the first game, and you're trying to find the president of Sega. A lot of people asked me what that was in the other video, so there you go. That's all it is. Very unfortunately titled thing, because What's Shenmue often leads to confusion when you're literally asking, what is that? Doesn't matter. So I would hope they would release something like Shenmue Saga, as I said before. We don't know. You know, the worst case scenario, other than them not making it, is that they would just say, okay, Shenmue 3 all by itself, that's all it is, and you don't get the others. Because then this transferring save thing wouldn't work, and that would really kind of ruin the vision. But in this day and age, with the ability to download those games, I don't think that would actually be a problem anymore. Which is ironic, because I really don't like digital gaming. But so, all I'm saying is that I think that Shenmue 3, this is potentially very good news. This Mark Cerny, Yu Suzuki thing. Again, they could have just met in a bathroom and been like, oh, hey, you're famous, let's take a photo. That could be all it was, and realistically, that's probably all it is. But I do like the idea that they could be discussing this, because, as I said before, the PlayStation 4 is the only viable option, in my estimation, to get the game made. A lot of people would love to see it go multi-plat. A lot of people say, oh, let's put it on PC, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be fine, that'd all be good. But no one is going to finance that. Sega certainly won't, and they'd be the only ones who would be interested in making it multi-plat. The only way you're going to get it out, really, is if someone else is willing to take that risk. Now, you're not going to get, Howard Hughes is dead, so you're not going to get anybody like that. No crazy guy who comes out and is like, I got billions of dollars, let's make Shenmue 3. None of us Shenmue fanatics have that kind of money, which is why Kickstarter was a nice thought, but it's just a thought. Sony is, as much as I hate to say it, the only possible home for Shenmue 3. I hate to say it, I really do, but it is true. Did I say PlayStation 3? I meant PlayStation 4. That is really the only place that could possibly end up. And times have changed. I don't really like Sony. I've been very clear about that. But I would accept it pretty willingly at this point. Because, we're never going to get a better deal. Sega's not going to make another console. It's not going to happen. And as I've said before repeatedly, you're not going to get it on a Nintendo console or a Microsoft console. Nintendo's not interested. And Microsoft kind of remembers it not working with Shenmue 2, but that's for completely different reasons. And of course, the 360 Microsoft entities will never work in Japan. They gave up on that a while ago. There was a time where Microsoft tried to make it work in Japan by giving them exclusives like that, but it never worked, and it never will. And Shenmue 3, interestingly, despite being one of the most Japanese games even possible, it takes place in Japan, it's by all Japanese people, etc., is not actually that popular in Japan. Most people who are fanatics of Shenmue are either American, Canadian, or, European. Now, granted, of course, Europe's not a country, but you see my point. They exist on that continent. Most people who play it are not Japanese, or people who really respect it are not Japanese. Now, certainly there are some, but they're just not the majority. So, it just seems unlikely to me that Microsoft would ever be interested. And even though, ironically, that it probably wouldn't matter if they sold in Japan, I still think that they probably... No, I don't see that happening. But I do see it happening on the PS4 as a very serious possibility, because Sony, unique amongst their competition, can get it out there, can make it the game it needs to be, and can get it in all regions, and actually dominate if they want to. And that hurts me as a massive Sega fan who's always been kind of anti-Sony. But I would, you know, guys, if Microsoft did all those horrible things the rumors are talking about, and if Sony was actually willing to work with Sega, and specifically Yu Suzuki, to get Shenmue 3 made, forgive and forget at this point, honestly. And I'd be very happy to see that happen. So, that's it. That's kind of my thoughts on this whole thing. And I want to know what you guys think. You know, would you be interested in the PlayStation 4 over the 720 if this happened? Now, I'm guessing you would, because you're watching a Shenmue rant, and we're a specific group. But I want to hear all sides of this. You know, are there people who think that it coming on a Sony console is forbidden, that they would rather never have the game? You know, are there people who can give a compelling argument as to why it could end up on a Nintendo or Microsoft console? Now, I've expressed before why I think that's simply not possible. And I really, before you make a video like that, I implore you to watch that and see my point before you try to come up with something else. That's all I'm saying, is just, you know, hear my side of it before we end up repeating ourselves. But, yeah, I would love to hear more people's feedback on it and how they would want it presented to them. You know, how would you want Shenmue? Now, some people have said, like, oh, you know, what I would want, I have one friend, shout out to Daniel if you're watching, who says he would want to see the whole series remade and have Shenmue 1 and Shenmue 2 be shorter and have, you know, just have them logically all continue right into where Shenmue 3 would be and have it just be one big game. Now, personally, I think that's a really bad idea, but, you know, kind of aiming it towards that Yakuza type of attitude, you know, making it less boring, although he's a big fan of Shenmue, and so am I, but a lot of people didn't quite embrace that game and experience the game the way it was supposed to be done. And so I don't like the idea that you try to change it for the masses in the way that Yakuza would operate. But maybe they would have to do that, and if they did, that'd be really disappointing. But, you know, again, that's something I want you guys to talk about. Discuss it with me. Personally, I want to see what I said before. I want to see Shenmue Saga. I want it to be exactly the way Yu Suzuki wants to make it. I don't want Sony to come in and be like, you gotta put zombies and guns in there. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see any crap like that. I just want Yu Suzuki to make his game, to make his third installment of his masterpiece, to conclude it. Now again, it would have to conclude with Shenmue 3. There's no chance for a Shenmue 4. And of course that was supposed to be 7 games. Now, what he said originally was that it was 16 chapters, okay? Chapter 1, they cut out Chapter 2, because apparently Chapter 2 was just a very short thing that happened on the boat after the end of the first game. And this is Chapters 3, 4, and 5. The rest of the games were supposed to take up 6 through 16. Now, he has since said that he has changed things to get it to, I believe it's only 11 chapters now, which, in my estimation, what that means is that he's accepting that he would have to do it all in one game, and I think he knows that there's no chance of a Shenmue 4, but Shenmue 3 has a little bit of a shot. So I think he's just ready to conclude it, and I hope that he does it correctly. That's what I would want to see. Now, of course, in a fantasy world, I'd want to see Shenmue 3 on the Dreamcast, but let's be real. That's why I would want to see Shenmue Saga. I would prefer it was multi-plat, of course, but that's not going to happen. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I keep going on and on and on, I apologize. So, I'm going to end it here. I just want you guys, please get out your cameras, start talking, let me know what you think, let's discuss this. And let's keep the ball rolling, because if we keep talking about this, if we keep it out there, this may actually happen. So that's it, guys. I want to thank you all for watching, assuming you made it all the way through this, and I'll see you all later.